Hi there, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this event, Investing in the Future of Ukraine in Europe, brought to you by the European Movement International and the European Investment Bank. My name is Maeve McMahon. I'm a journalist here in Brussels with Euronews, and I'm very pleased to be with you this afternoon to discuss this topic, one of the most important challenges and questions for the European Union at the moment. Since Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine back on the 24th of February, thousands of people have died, millions of people have been displaced, and the destruction is so severe that Ukraine needs $750 billion. That's according to the Ukrainian Prime Minister when he spoke back in Lugano in July. But this event this afternoon is not to tell you what you know already. It's been organised by the European Movement International and the EIB in Luxembourg in order to look at what's happening already on the ground in order to rebuild Ukraine, and to ask what else needs to be done, how Ukraine can prosper and attract investment despite the challenging context. We also have discussed, of course, Ukraine's path towards membership of the European Union, a process that began, of course, as you know, back on the 23rd of June after an EU summit here in Brussels. So to talk about all this and more, I'm delighted to welcome our esteemed panel. First up, Annika Eriksgård from the European Commission. She's the head of unit and director for international economic and financial relations for DG ECFIN. So welcome, Annika. Good afternoon. Great to see you. Thanks for being with us. We're also joined from Luxembourg by Lionel Rapaille. He's from the European Investment Bank. Lionel Rapaille is the director for lending operations in EU neighbouring countries, and his work has focused on Ukraine for many years. So Lionel, normally you're based in Luxembourg, but today I believe you might be over in New York, are you?
That's correct, yes. Close to the United Nations.
It's a good place to be this week. I feel like the whole world, the focus of the whole world's attention is there. So you're at the right place at the right time. So thank you for taking the time out to be with us as well for this discussion. So from one expert on the Eastern Partnership to the next, I'd now like to welcome Michael Siebert. He is the Managing Director for Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia and OSCE from the European External Action Service. That's the EAS, of course. So good afternoon to you, Michael. Great to see you.
Good afternoon.
I think you're in Brussels, right?
I'm in Brussels. Some people have to stay in Brussels.
Well, I can probably wave at you because my office, Euronews, is just opposite you. So we can probably wave at each other. Lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. And finally, bring in the perspective from Kyiv as well. I'm delighted to welcome Tatiana Shevchuk. She's the head of international programs at the Anti-Corruption Action Center. Good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi there. Greetings from Kyiv.
Great to have you. Very curious to hear, of course, your perspectives as well and more information from the ground there. And a warm welcome to all our viewers today. We're streaming live on the European Movement International's Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and on the YouTube channel. So thanks for being with us. Make sure that you join the conversation today. Tell us what you think. Tell us what comments you might have by just popping them on the bottom of the video. And I'll make sure to channel them in to our panelists. So first, as this event is co-hosted by the EIB, I guess I'd like to put my first question to Lionel over at the EIB to find out what exactly the EIB has been doing regarding Ukraine, because I know this has not just started on the 24th or the 25th of February this year. Your focus has been on Ukraine for many, many years. So just paint a picture of what you've been up to, what the challenges have been, and if you're addressing the needs of Ukraine right now through all these operations and projects.
Thank you, Mia. Well, first of all, and thank you very much for organizing this roundtable on Ukraine. I think this week marks exactly 7 months since we woke up to the news that Russia has commenced its military invasion of Ukraine. So I think it's a very timely discussion to discuss on the future of Ukraine. And in a way, it resonates very well with our duty to support Ukraine on its integration path toward the EU. Indeed, as you said, I think the EIB has been active in Ukraine for a number of years. And of course, since the association agreement in 2015, we substantially scaled up our support to the country. Now, when the war broke up on 24th of February, well, we had obviously to adjust substantially our support to the country. I think it's important first to have in mind the pain, devastation caused by the unprovoked, unjustified war by the Russian Federation. As you reminded us, I mean, this resulted in civilian casualties, millions of displaced people, and there was a massive shock on the economy. I mean, there are some signs of improvement of the economy now, but we are clearly well below the pre-war level. So in this context, it was indeed very important for all international partners to be able to step in swiftly to support the country. So from an EIB perspective, what we did was, with very strong support and coordination with the European Commission, to mobilize funding for immediate and urgent needs. So actually, beginning of March, just a few days after the invasion, we disbursed almost 700 million euros for urgent liquidity needs of the country. A bit later, in July, our board has approved 1.6 billion of additional support to basically repair the most essential damaged infrastructure. And out of this, actually, we have already disbursed last week 500 million. I think these resources are very important because they enable the government to cope with ongoing spendings for social needs, paying salaries, paying pensions, but also, and this is what they do with the EIB funding, to support, I would say, the initial recovery process. So to prepare the next winter, to enable to have critical infrastructures being repaired, to have schools, hospitals, being refurbished to enable people to have access to these services. So in a nutshell, I think we really made all possible efforts to support the country very swiftly, very rapidly, and in very strong coordination with international partners and first and foremost with the European Commission.
Okay, Lionel, thank you so much for that. And in a minute, we'll hear from Tatiana and hear how those funds, of course, are being absorbed on the ground. But I'd like now just to hear from Annika, the director of DG ECFIN there regarding international economic and financial relations. Can you just elaborate on what we've been hearing there from Lionel, from your perspective, from where you're sitting at the Commission?
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you also from our side for organizing it. I think it's really important to get some clarity in a very, very uncertain world on what's going on. So just to underline what Lionel said in terms of the shock that the economy has been hit by, there are no estimates that are certain on the degree, but roughly GDP probably fell or is probably falling by 40% this year. That's a massive shock by all standards. You referred to in your introduction the reconstruction need of some $750 billion that the Ukrainian authorities put out in early July at the Lugano conference, which is very true. I was there. But I think by now we have some more accurate estimates or some more granular one done by the World Bank together with us in the Commission and the Ukrainian authorities that point to a reconstruction need with the cutoff date of 1st June of $350 billion. So this is still going on every day. The world is continuing, or the war is continuing. So clearly this figure will increase, but it is not necessarily as high as the 750. That said, I think the international community has really come together. In many ways, swift adoptions of a number of sanctions towards Russia, also swift adoptions of a number of measures taken to support financially Ukraine, humanitarian aid, military support. From where I am sitting, it's a lot of financial support that we have been providing already in terms of macro financial assistance. 1.2 billion dispersed in the first half of this year, another 1 billion dispersed to bridge the country over the summer months, early August. We have just proposed 5 more billions, which we are now in the process of putting together. The Council has adopted it today, and we will look forward to disperse that before the end of the year. That's part of the exceptional macro financial assistance that was announced back in May as a short-term relief, recognizing that before we can come to any reconstruction of the country, we need to ensure that the country can cope with and ensure macroeconomic stability as as they are so bravely fighting the war. So this, I think, is is an effort that is very much done in close cooperation across IFIs, the international financial institutions. We work very, very closely. I see Lionel at times in these coordination meetings we have with the IMF, with the World Bank, with other actors, EBRD, that all do what they are relatively best at, support the sectors they are relatively working closest on, to fulfill financing needs that are of some billion every month. I mean, whether that is 3.5, 4, 5 billion is subject to maybe discussion, but it is a quite substantial need, as Lionel spelled out, in terms of ensuring that pensions are paid, that schools can function to an extent, that critical reconstruction can be done to ensure that the country continues to function, that there is enough stability so that they have space enough to fight the war for as long as that is needed. And I think there the international community has really come together in a remarkable way. But it is not over, and we need to look forward into next year to make sure that Ukraine is sort of supported by its partner also in the months to come. It's clear that it is difficult to find enough funds and make them available enough fast. There, I think we collectively all need to do better. Thank you.
Annika Eriksgård there telling us we all need to do better, and clarifying that figure, clarifying that it's actually 350 billion. And in fact, I had a look at that IMF report just a week and a half ago when the Ukrainian minister was in town having meetings, I think, with yourself and other colleagues there from the European Commission. As you say, a lot done, but a lot more to do, because the war is still very much ongoing with no end in sight as the country tries to rebuild. I'd love to get now the perspective from the EAS, from Michael Siebert, the Managing Director for Russia and Eastern European, and a man who's been watching that neighbourhood for many, many years in his day job.
Thank you very much, Mia. And Annika has made it relatively easy for me, because she has mentioned already all the basics of where we stand and what we have done. Maybe I will try to step back a little bit and get the overall picture from a political point of view. First of all, also I would like to thank you for organizing this, because it is really an up-and-coming topic that will probably for many more months be under discussion, and will be very important for the future of Ukraine. So when we look at what is happening on the ground, it is very much an evolving picture. While we are speaking, there are news coming in that in several parts of occupied Ukraine, the Russians want to organize sham referenda to allow for a pseudo-legal way to annex these parts of Ukraine to Russia. So the situation is very much evolving. You also see the situation on the ground, where we had some impressive counterattacks by the Ukrainians, bringing them back some other parts of their country. But I think we have to be very cognizant of the fact that the war will carry on for quite some time. We don't know for how long, but it will most probably move on about over the winter, as the situation on the ground will make it more and more difficult, with mud and then cold and snow to operate, while we don't know exactly how the situation will be for people in Ukraine, how many IDPs we will still have and take care of, as we have been doing very quickly and impressively. Also, how many refugees into the European Union we will have. Was the quickest and most massive influx of people into the European Union, and probably in world history, into a different territory. And we have, I think, very well taken care of those people, and are now preparing for many of them who want to and have to stay in the EU to keep on doing that. Also, on the reconstruction, I think I would plead for an incremental view on this. Juggling between three-digit billion of dollar figures is maybe not what we really need now. We should focus on discussing a structure that can be a good way to organize the reconstruction, a kind of governance system that will be working well, and we will probably discuss this later here. And at the same time, while we are doing this, and we hope that our view that the European Union will be the preferred partner for Ukraine to work together on reconstruction, and at the same time on implementing the necessary reforms that we need for organizing this reconstruction. And that the same reforms, by the way, are important for Ukraine to work on, to get on with the process as a candidate country for the European Union, the accession process. So that is one thing, the governance aspect. But we should also focus on the immediate needs, as has been pointed out, because the winter is coming, and we should just very practically try to fulfill the next important requirements for the Ukrainians suffering in the country.
Okay, Michael Siebert there, thank you so much for that. You mentioned a lot, and you alluded to the situation for people in Ukraine. So why not bring in now Tatiana and get the perspective from a Ukrainian, from Tatiana Shevchuk, the head of international programs at the Anti-Corruption Center. Tatiana, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. And just tell us from where you're standing now. You're hearing all these announcements of figures and numbers, and just tell us what's happening on the ground. Has the support been sufficient? Are you seeing this money in reality then? Is it working?
The fact that I'm in Kyiv right now and I can participate freely at the call is a sign that support of our partners actually working, because the situation on the occupied territories and the territories that are far from the front line stabilized, and we are trying to build back country as far as possible. So if you are going into the streets of the Kyiv, probably you won't tell difference between Kyiv of 2022 and 2021. Probably the only difference is that last year we were wearing masks. This year many people wear military fatigues. That's ours. This like relative peace and stability is thanks to our partners, to the European Union and other countries who really stood up with us from the very first hours of full-scale Russian invasion. And the fact that our government is working, that our economy is trying to find the ground on its in this very difficult position when our export is blocked by 50-70%, is an indication that we received necessary support from our partners, and we are. I can find the words to thank for that. Because we receive humanitarian assistance for the regions and people who suffer from the war, we receive financial assistance with those numbers which were already told here, and we receive military assistance which helps us to win on the battleground. Of course, the recent days, the biggest issue we are discussing is successful counteroffensive and the military victories of our army on the ground, because it's something that proves that all our efforts in the last months were fruitful, and we are on the right way to win and succeed on the battlefield. The other issue we are currently discussing is, of course, winter, because it will be very tough for all Ukrainians here in Ukraine, for citizens of the EU who will suffer from their high energy prices. But the thing we fear the most during this winter is the attack, the probable attack of Russia on our critical infrastructure, because they already showed that when they are losing on the battlefield, they start to retaliate on civil population. The recent attacks on Kharkiv electro station, on the hydro dam on Kryvyi Rih. This is a clear indication that those attacks on civil infrastructure continue, and they will be particularly dangerous during the winter time, because blackouts, lack of electricity, lack of gas and heating, it could create humanitarian, like local humanitarian catastrophes. That's something that we are preparing, and I think at the moment we have sustainable resources and sustainable planning, how to prevent the worst case scenarios. Of course, the particularly complicated is the situation on the recently deoccupied cities and towns, which suffered the most and that destructed the most. But this is something that we are dealing with, and especially what is common between Ukrainians and our talks with the government is that not only particular needs is what we are discussing, we are also actively discussing the reconstruction of Ukraine, because there are immediate stabilization needs, but we are very keen on dedicating our efforts to the future Ukraine, to what Ukraine will be once the war is over. And we believe this is more democratic country with better rule of law and better investment climate that will help us to rebuild the country quicker.
Okay, Tatiana, we'll come back to you in a minute, but and as you said there, the winter will be tough, highlighting there the main challenges you see coming this winter. And you also mentioned reconstruction and the conversations that you're having on that. And I'd like to get the perspective now from Annika Eriksgård at the Commission when it comes to reconstruction efforts. What are you doing to make sure that they meet national priorities and the local needs of people like Tatiana and her family and friends?
That is a very, very, very good question. So first of all, thanks to Tatiana to be part of this. I think it's really helpful to hear the local perspective, and it is important, in part because there are so many different developments in Ukraine. It's not like this is one development that looks similar across the country. So when you look at just the damage needs assessment, clearly the impact is much higher in the regions, in the oblast, closer to Russia or just north of Crimea. But the impact can be felt throughout the country. But with that also comes a recognition that the help needs to be tailored to what is most needed, where and how. And I think when we look at reconstruction, and I would like to pick up what Michael said earlier on the importance of thinking about this not just as one big number we need to deliver upon, but incremental. What can we do now? How can we build up a coordination platform, a governance system to make sure that help is forthcoming in a systematic way, where it goes to where it's most needed now, in the sectors and areas where it's most needed. This, I think, is something you need to have in place at the same time as we continue to provide short-term financing. And I just wanted to pick up again on the World Bank Commission and Ukraine report that came on the 9th of September. The recognition that the most urgent needs right now is indeed, as Tatiana talked about in terms of the heating, but we also clearly see needs on housing. There are many IDPs, but there are also returning migrants showing the willingness to come back and work with and for the country, which is absolutely remarkable, as well as energy broadly and needs to kickstart the economy. And part of this discussion today was also to see what can the EU and other partners do to help Ukraine. But there are also opportunities in this further out. There will be, I think, a reconstruction that will be partly and certainly initially very much financed by the public sector, by official creditors, such as the EU, such as the EIB, etc. But there will also be a lot of business opportunities at the local level, at the regional level, in various sectors that will come forward. And I think it's important to think about this in a way of variable geometries, if you like, where part of the countries might be in a rather challenging situation, while critical reconstruction is starting in other parts of the country, where the economic recovery is starting in some of the regions in a more pronounced manner. So one needs to work on this in parallel and having the different viewpoints inside. I'm not so sure that there will be sort of a clean peace in the whole country from one day to another. I think we will have a much more fluid situation than that, and that the reconstruction should be thought about in that light. That's why it's also important to have the governance system in place. Linking it to enlargement is absolutely essential. So we do not think about reconstruction as in building back or building back better. We think about it as in leaping into the future, so building for a future with Ukraine's European aspirations in mind, with them, as you rightly said in the beginning, having obtained candidate status, which is an enormously big step and which will require a lot of efforts to get there. But therefore, it's also so important and makes it natural that the EU is a viable partner standing by Ukraine in this process. But the ownership must come from Ukraine from within, with the idea that building an economy and society that is fully European and with the values and the functioning economy that we have in Europe, which also includes then work on and further work on judiciary, on anti-corruption. Again, interesting to have you here in that respect, Tatjana, but on a lot of areas. So this will not be an easy task, but it will be with that direction in mind.
And we'll come back to that point, Annika, about the reform path and about corruption in just a minute. But let's stick to the economy and the investment. And I'm looking at the poster behind you. It says, "Be brave like Ukraine." And I guess we could also say now, be determined like Ukrainians, because Ukrainians and the business community now are already on tour across Europe at trade fairs, calling for people to invest in Ukraine, that Ukraine is a place that people should invest. So they're extremely determined, and they're planning to be the ones as well with their very own hands to rebuild their future. But I want to go back to a point that both Annika and Lionel mentioned earlier, which is that shock to the Ukrainian economy and the GDP falling. And just ask perhaps Lionel and then maybe Michael for their perspective on just talk us through how the war directly impacted Ukraine's borrowing needs and funding conditions and operational environment in general.
Thank you. Well, indeed, and I think we can only praise and admire the resilience of the institutions, of the society, of the economy, and as mentioned by Tatjana, despite the substantial shock on the economy, despite the hardship, still the economy is afloat, the institutions continue to function normally, which is absolutely remarkable. I think in a way what you are mentioning here leads to two things. The fact that there is a need to have continuous financial assistance to enable the macro financial stability of the country. And I think here the predictability of the financing sources for the international partners is absolutely key. Why this is key? Because otherwise the alternative is unfortunately either to reduce expenditures for the government, notably social expenditures, or to what we call monetize the deficits. But this leads to inflation, and this erodes the purchasing power of the population, and notably the power for part of the segments of the population. So it's absolutely key to continue with this macro financial assistance to the extent possible. But in parallel, we need to stop the degradation of the economy. and enable a rebound. And here I would say that starting to invest in the recovery now is also essential. Not only does the country need to invest in basic public services, it was mentioned by my other panel members, I mean, to enable internally displaced people to have access to housing, to enable access to public services, but also for the, let's say, productive sectors, there is a need to rebuild critical transport routes to exports. There is a need to have access to finance for working capital to basically continue, just to take the example of the agricultural sector, to enable to harvest, to invest in storage capacity. So it's absolutely key not to assume that we will wait the end of the war. This recovery process needs to start now, and therefore we cannot make these distinctions between, let's say, what is humanitarian support, macrofinancial assistance, and investment.
And that reconstruction path could be a long one, with some estimates saying it could take up to a decade. But indeed, as you say, it needs to start now. It needs to be in full swing. I'd like to get the perspective now from Michael Siebert. And just for anyone who's watching us today, watching this event all about the future of Ukraine, if you have any questions, do pop them at the bottom and I'll make sure to address them to our panelists. But Michael Siebert, if you could just elaborate there on what Lionel was saying.
Yes, thank you. Again, from a more political perspective, I think to continue this successful cooperation between Ukraine and the European Union, and to support Ukraine in their brave defense against this unjustified Russian aggression and war, it is very important, of course, that on both sides people are working together and get the support of the citizenship to continue this policy for quite a while, as has been said before. In Ukraine, at the moment, we see that there is huge support for the president and the government. There is great unanimity on the objectives and on the great decisiveness and dedication to defend the country and regain lost territories. And it is coupled, and this I think is very impressive, and I would like to very much commend Ukrainians for that under this war situation, still the administration is well working, has been preparing for the accession process to the European Union, and they have started to work on the points that have been outlined in the European Council decision. For instance, the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor has been appointed, the High Council of Justice was filled with respected lawyers, and the media law was adopted, and we're now waiting for the appointment of the new head of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU. And there is also a new draft law on the Constitutional Court, which is being accessed currently. So this is very, very impressive. And of course, on the anti-oligarch legislation and then the overall overarching reform strategy and national minority legislation, we are also waiting for more political action in Kiev, but this has been done in a marvelous way in a very short time. And then looking at the other side, at us in the European Union, of course we have to sustain our support over the winter, which will not be as difficult for us as it will be for Ukrainians. But still, when we look at the economic situation, at inflation, at gas prices, fuel prices, etc., a possible further use of fossil fuels as a weapon by the Russians, the Russian government, this will also, for our Western societies, be quite a test, and we need to explain. Politicians need to become statesmen and stateswomen to explain to citizens how and why this is so so important to sustain. And then I'm pretty sure that once we are over this winter, that we are in a much better position, because time is playing in our favor in the mid and long term. And also the effects of the strongest ever package of sanctions against Russia will more and more have an impact on the Russian economy. It already has, but it will restrain the possibilities for Putin to finance this war more and more. And as I said, time will be on our side. That's the scenario we have to follow.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. And on those sanctions, the European Union sanctions, I do want to come back to them. But first, I'd like to go back to Kyiv and get the perspective from Tetiana on the corruption and the anti-corruption and judicial reforms, because of course, corruption perhaps hasn't gone anywhere despite the war. And we do remember when President Zelensky did get voted in a couple of years ago, it was in fact to rid Ukraine of its corruption. And of course, for the country to modernize its economy and one day become a member of the European Union, fighting corruption will be one of its main objectives. Can you just tell us what's happening there on the ground, and is the country on track?
I would like to remind that we started our anti-corruption and judicial reforms 8 years ago as a part of our Euro integration reforms. They were the part of our association agreement with the EU and visa liberalization plan with the EU. And the idea that fighting corruption and judicial reform is bringing us on track with European integration only reinforced once we received the candidacy status for the EU membership. And support for joining the EU is tremendously high, and this unique consensus between all the political parties and all the parts of the society that Ukraine should be the part of the EU. And this idea helps us to continue those reforms. They are not easy, but we managed to get good results in these 8 years. And at the moment, we should continue that. And there is finally understanding of the government to do that, and willingness of the government to implement all the necessary reforms and support those reforms. And as the general society demands from politicians to deliver the results in terms of EU integration, I think it will be even easier and quicker to put Ukraine on these reform rails. I have to mention that judicial reform was launched was launched in its active phase back in January this year, and it continues through the wartime, which is very unique situation. And I hope that in a few months we will see already the first results of renewal of Ethics Council of Judiciary. Oh, sorry, not the Ethics Council. Through the work of Ethics Council, we will see the renewal of the work of High Council of Judiciary. This is like the first phase of the reform, because the importance and pressure that Ukrainians put on the government lays in the understanding that reconstruction and recovery of the country is not like bringing lots of money to the country, but rebuilding and reinventing Ukraine as more democratic and better governed country. That's what we aspire, and that's what we are working for.
And another question I have for our panelists, our economics here around the table, is about Russia's financial responsibility here for the immense damages to the critical infrastructure in Ukraine. I mean, should they be footing the bill in means of war reparations, for example? Annika, I might start with you because I know you have to leave. You've got another meeting to go to. So Annika, I'll just get your perspective on that. And I know you wanted to mention, allude to the sanctions as well and global governance. So go ahead.
No, thank you very much. Indeed, I think we need to look at both the need to support Ukraine in the short term and in the longer term, whilst at the same time looking at what do we do on the other side of this war. And Michael already referred to that sanctions have been put together. They came, I think, remarkably swiftly and fast, has a certain impact, but they are above all very, very gradually kicking in. And what we have at the same time seen is that this extreme degree of uncertainty has pushed up energy prices. So at the same time, Russia has actually so far fared reasonably well, or better than many expected only a few months back. This reflects, on the one hand, the high energy prices for now, and on the other hand, that also military activity of this scale is to some extent thereby boosting their industrial production to make sure that they can sort of fight the war, which is sort of a kind of weird side effect. But what is also clear is that the sanctions, as they are designed and as they are gradually kicking in, is going to deprive Russia, of a lot of growth going forward. And you can see it already now in terms of spare parts that are not there, in terms of a brain drain, of a lot of highly qualified persons leaving the country. And so it is above all on the growth potential that we see an impact, and that growth is expected to be, while it is not falling as much and by no way near as much as in Ukraine this year, and there is a negative growth rate expected for this year, but not very big. We do see a much, much lower growth rate going forward for Russia than would otherwise would have been the case, and it will take them a decade or something before they can in any way be near in catching up on this. What I think you asked for a question in terms of should they contribute. Obviously, they should contribute. The question is how they should contribute. It is also very important to think how to end conflicts to ensure that there is a stability for the situation going forward, without in any way comparing this situation to what we are seeing here and talking about now, just making the point on the end of the First World War and the end of the Second World War, taking this into account. And what we are trying to do now is to find a way of isolating Russia without throwing global governance out through the window. We have a lot of global challenges we want to address, we must be able to address. And while we have had an extraordinarily fast and good cooperation among G7 or G7 plus over the last 7 months, we have at the same time not had the same engagement between advanced and emerging economies as we normally have in forums like G20 or in the World Bank, the IMF, because there is sort of a Western narrative and a Russian narrative that clearly puts different spells on what is now the root cause of the economic problems we see in the world. Is it Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is clearly what we see as the origin, or is it what Russia says, the sanctions imposed by the West, which fuels food prices, fuels energy prices, that is driving this economic downturn, which is what they are to some extent successfully touring Africa, Central Asia, etc., and selling. And what we really try to do is to ensure that we don't end up in a trap of the West against the rest, that we really have a capacity to engage with our global partners, not Russia right now, that is very clear, but with other global partners, to work on challenges like climate change, like debt distress, and first and foremost, how to deal with food prices, food security issues, where there are quite a few countries in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, that really struggle right now. So I think we have a need to understand and be able to work on a few things in parallel. So here we have then the issue of isolating Russia, of punishing Russia, of making sure that Russia is part of the solution and part of the reconstruction efforts of Ukraine, but also without necessarily cutting off Russia for the rest of its future once the war is over. This is not an easy task to do, but we need to think about it with that in mind and with prior experiences in mind so that we don't repeat the end of the First World War.
Okay, thank you so much, Annika, Eriksgård. Thank you so much for being with us. I think you might have to clock off in just a minute, but thank you for being with us. It was great to hear your perspective there from the European Commission. I thought it was quite interesting what Annika was sparking there. Maybe Lionel Rapaille over there in New York, can you tell us what's going on kind of in the corridors? What kind of conversations are you hearing there in the sidelines of the UN General Assembly regarding those questions that Annika posed?
Thank you. Well, indeed, I think first of all, I think it's important to have in mind of the effect which the sanctions which have been swiftly put in place and gradually can have on Russia. Just taking a step back very quickly, I mean, from an EIB perspective, 2014 annexation of Crimea, we immediately actually decided to stop supporting investment project in Russia. So just to say that, and this type of elements, I think, are very important because indeed this needs to have an impact, and this has an impact on the overall, let's say, economic growth potential of the economy. What I can see is two things. One is that, and I was actually participating yesterday to a roundtable on the impact of the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion in Latin America. And it's striking to see that inflation caused by the Russian invasions leads to increased poverty, to hunger, famine, to social unrest in a number of regions of the world. And obviously, this resonates very strongly. And I think that's where the EU international partners need to be very convincing on the fact that this is not a result of the sanctions. This is simply and only because of the invasion, 24th of February. Separately, I think there is an expectation of, let's say, European Union to help and support where possible these countries to face these challenges. So what I can say, for instance, from an EIB perspective, is that we are very actively supporting countries like Egypt, Northern African countries to go through this crisis, because obviously there is this feeling that they end up supporting the consequences of the war on the European continent, which has nothing to do with them. So I think it's also very important that we step up our support toward these countries. And that we, let's say, have a very clear narrative on the root causes of these problems.
Mm-hmm. And I can see, Lionel, the root causes of these problems are very clear to you and to those here in the European quarter of Brussels, but not to the people in the streets beyond the capitals. And just tomorrow, for example, here in Brussels, there's protests planned tomorrow morning by people protesting against the cost of living crisis and blaming everyone around them and not understanding that this is, of course, down to the sanctions, and this is the price that people in Europe have to pay for peace and, of course, for the mistakes that were made in the past. But let's go back to that question of Russia and the role and Russia's financial responsibility. I'd like to get the perspective from Tatiana on this and also from Michael. So Tatiana, if you'd like to take that one first.
As victims of aggression, we would like to have justice, first and foremost. Ukrainian people demand justice for illegal act of aggression, for the war crimes committed on our territory and destruction of our economy and our infrastructure. we want to have this process based on international law. Receive it either through negotiations, peace deal, or through the diligent ruling of a certain international tribunal, which would be established, or any other international body. In this way, we see it as a method to return to their international order based on the rules. The rules were violated, and here is a clear way how they should be reprimanded. We don't see, unfortunately, other way that certain types of reparations from Russia to have the compensation for all they done on our territory and for our people. Of course, the willingness of the Ukrainian government is to use the money, the funds currently seized in the foreign jurisdictions, like the assets of central bank or Russian oligarchs, as a mean to recover the damage done to Ukrainian economy.
Okay, thank you so much, Tatiana. Michael, Siebert, I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that, on what Tatiana was saying and about the role of Russia contributing to the reconstruction of Ukraine.
Yes, that's a very important question, and I fully understand Tatiana and all the Ukrainians that they legitimately feel that it is also up to Russia to come in on the costs of reconstruction with all they destroyed and are still destroying, and especially on civilian targets in a sometimes indiscriminate way or targeted even way. Damaging the places that civilian people need in their daily lives. So this is very legitimate, but it is also very difficult to make it a reality when it comes to negotiation at some point about the end of the war and the consequences of it. So that will be an uphill battle. Then, of course, there has been the debate how much, whether and how much, and in what way we could try to use the frozen assets, the Russian frozen assets, to be part of that money that contributes to reconstruction. It's quite a bit. We know that, for instance, the reserves of the central bank have been frozen, half of them, around 300 billion euro, and a couple of member states of the European Union also have seized physical assets, the famous yachts and villas, etc., of people close to Putin and officials. That amounts up to almost 15 billion euro as of early September, and has doubled from April. So also an impressive sum. Now, from freezing to seizing, it is not an easy path. It is relatively easy to freeze assets under the sanctions, but to seize them, to be able to reuse them and help reconstruction is legally much more difficult. So the Commission has created a freeze and seize task force together with the US and with Ukraine already in March, and working with several legal institutions. Then there are plans to add the violation of our EU restrictive measures, sanctions, to make their violation a crime. That again would allow, in a certain way, to seize these assets, which is otherwise not possible. So the confiscation, that is the difficult step, and we are working on that, also with other suggestions, like in the last package of sanctions we included to make it obligatory for individuals on the sanctions list, those we have sanctioned, to report about their assets to member states' authorities. And again, if they don't do so, that could be considered as a crime. And such legal measures will hopefully make it possible to at least get hold of part of these frozen assets and to bring them into the big basket needed for reconstruction, to which, of course, also we hope private businesses, civil society, and many others will contribute from in and outside Ukraine once the conditions will allow for that.
Okay, thank you. And just on the role of the EIB in that reconstruction, that big challenge of reconstruction, Lionel, can you just enlighten us on what the role will be? We can't hear you, Lionel. Just, you're on mute. Yep.
Apologize.
No problem.
No, on the reconstruction needs, I mean, it was mentioned by Annika, the figure is really daunting as to the need in terms of financing volume. So I think indeed it will be key to have this prioritization of investments. It will certainly span under a number of years. Coordination will be absolutely key. And I think here we expect it to be led, driven by Ukraine in partnership with international partners, and first and foremost by the European Union. And last but not least, I mean, there are some key principles which need to sustain this reconstruction. So very strong stakeholder engagement, the importance to address differentiated needs between different regions. It was mentioned by Tetiana, I think the importance of transparency, anti-corruption systems to be in place, so that we have a sustained reconstruction process. From an EIB perspective, I mean, we had actually, after the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in Donbass, a program in place of recovery, which was extremely successful, with more than 200 schools, kindergartens, hospitals being refurbished, with a stakeholder engagement, actually with the civil society conducting this consultation process. Unfortunately, as we speak now, with a number of these assets being in occupied territories and being damaged, but we will bring them back. This is absolutely clear. We will build again these facilities.
Okay.
As the EIB, I would just say that we will support Ukraine towards its path to the EU. I mean, during the war, up to the way to the EU and as a member state. I mean, we've done this with 22 other member states, so we are really pleased to do this with Ukraine. And we are now preparing instruments in terms of lending, in terms of advisory support, which will enable to tackle the reconstruction challenge. So we look very much forward working with Ukraine, international partner on this.
And that's the message that we heard as well from the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, just last week when she addressed the European Parliament in Strasbourg with her State of the Union, saying the support to Ukraine was unshakable. She was dressed from head to toe in the Ukrainian colours, along with all her colleagues, her female colleagues from the Commission, and she was standing, of course, alongside Madam Zelenska, the wife of President Zelensky. So yes, I think the support from the European Union has been very clear from the outset whose side it's been on. I would like to give the last word to Tetiana, to our Ukrainian around the panel, because of course this discussion this afternoon is all about investing in your future, the future of yourself, your family and your friends. So any final comment or message to all those who've been joining us online for this event? Tetiana, the floor is yours.
I just want to say a huge thank you for all your efforts of supporting Ukraine. I've never been more optimistic about the future of Ukraine than I'm now, despite the situation in my country, because I, together with all my colleagues and fellows, we see the huge, enormous support of Ukraine, that besides all odds, we are supported. Besides the undecided future, they are already planning for reconstruction and recovery of Ukraine. So I'm positive that we'll be fine, and after this we will have more stronger, more prosperous Ukraine. and even more stronger and more united Europe. That's my positive thinking, and just keep the good work you're all doing. We are really grateful for it here in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Some lovely optimistic words there from Tatiana. Let's see if the 27 can hang on in there this winter, what looks to be a tricky winter here in Europe and an even more challenging one for Ukraine. Tatiana Shevchuk, the head of international programs there from the Anti-Corruption Centre in Kyiv. Thank you so much for joining us. Also, Michael Siebert here in Brussels, Managing Director for Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, OSCE at the European External Action Service, the EAS. Thank you also to Lionel Rapaille, the Director for Lending Operations in EU neighbouring countries from the EIB. And thanks, of course, to Annika Eriksgård, the Director of DG ECFIN, International Economic and Financial Relations. Thank you so much as well to you for joining us, for being with us this afternoon for this discussion. You can watch it back. We recorded it in case you missed it. Thanks to the European Movement International and the EIB for hosting this event. Take care and see you soon.